But I warn you, if you make any further inquiries, or if you say a single word to anyone about what you have seen, there will be the most dire consequences for you and your family. Do you understand? Very well.
In the future, evil will no longer simply have to be avoided. It will have to be understood and transformed. Rudolf Steiner, GA 185. The most terrifying force in the world is not the open worship of darkness, not the man who bows before evil knowing exactly what he serves. Such a man at least understands the nature of his deed. No, the truly chilling figure is the one who believes he stands in the light. History trembles not because of those who consciously choose destruction, but because of those who convince themselves that destruction is sacred duty. The hand that burns, conquers, humiliates, deceives, or exterminates becomes far more dangerous when it believes itself to be an instrument of heaven. For the conscious servant of evil still knows he is crossing a threshold. He feels the weight of the abyss beneath his feet. But the man who commits evil in the name of God walks forward without hesitation. His conscience is quiet. His cruelty becomes righteousness. His violence becomes purification. His lies become revelation. In that moment, something dreadful occurs in the human soul. Evil no longer appears as evil. It appears as mission. It is the ancient inversion. I am the one who wills evil, yet does good in God's name. Once this transformation takes hold, there is almost no limit to what can be justified. Wars become holy. Oppression becomes order. Deception becomes strategy. The destruction of human beings becomes the preservation of truth. And because the actor believes himself righteous, he cannot be persuaded otherwise. Every objection only proves to him that he is persecuted for his holiness. This is the most frightening mask evil can wear, for the devil rarely appears with horns. He appears with conviction, and the most dangerous man is not the one who says, "I serve darkness." It is the one who says with absolute certainty, "I serve God." There is a curious habit that appears again and again in contemporary anthroposophical circles. When confronted with a figure like Jeffrey Epstein, many are quick to reach for the language of black magic, occult decadence, or vague Ahrimanic manipulation. The gesture feels satisfying. It signals moral seriousness. It places the event within a spiritual frame. And yet, too often, the analysis stops there. The label is applied. The shudder is felt. The conversation moves on. But anthroposophy, if it is to remain worthy of its name as spiritual science, cannot permit itself the comfort of atmospheric explanations. Rudolf Steiner again and again warned against what he called nebulous mysticism, the tendency to replace exact spiritual investigation with suggestive but unexamined phrases. To say black magic was involved may express a mood. It does not yet constitute knowledge. Nor is it sufficient simply to label the Epstein files as Ahrimanic or Usuric and consider the matter settled. Such language may correctly gesture toward the what, but by itself, it risks becoming a kind of disembodied boogeyman, a spiritual diagnosis that explains everything and therefore explains nothing. If spiritual science is to be exact, it must go further. It must ask not only what appears, but how it comes into being, why it takes the form it does, where the enabling conditions arise, and when in the evolution of consciousness such configurations become possible. There is also the uncomfortable modern reality that the public handling of such scandals increasingly unfolds in a highly mediated environment. Document releases, headline cycles, and waves of online reaction often follow patterns that feel, to many observers, strangely rehearsed. Whether by design or by the natural dynamics of mass media, the danger is the same. Attention becomes captured by the spectacle of the files themselves. But this work is not primarily about the files. It is not about parsing every redaction or amplifying every sensational detail. The moral nature of the crimes involved is already self-evident and requires no further lip service. The real anthroposophical task is deeper and more demanding. It is to understand what the phenomenon represents, to ask what long-term cultural, psychological, and spiritual conditions allow such networks of power, secrecy, exploitation, and mutual compromise to crystallize in the first place. In other words, anthroposophy has a duty not merely to recoil, but to understand. When we encounter a modern network of power, secrecy, sexual exploitation, and mutual compromise, the question is not only what crimes were committed, the deeper question is what kind of spiritual historical pattern allows such structures to arise at all. Too often, even well-meaning observers remain on the surface. They point to the darkness but do not investigate its genealogy. They sense the Ahrimanic but do not examine the pathways through which inversion becomes system. This is precisely where spiritual science must become exact. For if anthroposophy cannot illuminate the continuity of impulses across time, if it cannot distinguish between isolated criminality and recurring patterns of moral inversion, then it risks becoming what Steiner most warned against: a vocabulary of suggestion without the discipline of knowledge. What follows, therefore, is not an attempt to sensationalize nor to attribute modern crimes to any single historical sect. Rather, it is an effort to do what anthroposophy at its best demands: to look carefully, historically, and unsentimentally at patterns of inversion that have appeared before in human spiritual history, and to ask whether structural echoes can be discerned in our own time. Because if we refuse that work, we may satisfy our indignation, but we will fail our responsibility to know. I am aware that this line of inquiry may not immediately appear to some as a spiritual endeavor, yet Rudolf Steiner himself united spiritual perception with exact historical observation. His acute study of political and cultural developments led him to speak about the preconditions and preparations that preceded the First World War, not merely in abstract mystical terms, but through concrete historical analysis. The point here is not to abandon the spiritual dimension, but to follow his example in recognizing how spiritual impulses work through human decisions, institutions, and long-prepared circumstances. To understand the supersensible seriously is also to observe carefully how it is executed through human hands. Some historians of Sabbatean and Frankist thought describe a dangerous paradox that emerged in the most radical circles of the movement. The traditional Jewish hope was clear. Redemption would come through repentance, through elevation, through a return to holiness. But in certain antinomian interpretations that developed after the crisis of Sabbatai Sevi, a darker logic began to take shape. If the sparks of redemption lie buried even in the lowest realms, then the Messiah, some reasoned, must descend into those depths. From there, in the most extreme readings later associated with circles around Jacob Frank, a chilling conclusion could emerge. If humanity cannot realistically become wholly pure, then collective descent begins to appear to the distorted mind as the quicker path. Not everyone can become a saint, but everyone can be pulled into sin. This was never normative Judaism. The rabbis of the time recognized the danger immediately and condemned these teachings as heresy. Yet the psychological inversion remains deeply unsettling, the moment when transgression begins to wear the mask of divine service, when destruction is reframed as preparation, when the violation of boundaries is reimagined as sacred necessity. That is what made the Sabbatean crisis so explosive, and it is why the reaction against it was so severe. Because once sin acquires a redemptive aura, moral gravity begins to fail. Now return to the present moment. Files surface. Names appear and disappear behind redactions. Public attention moves in waves of outrage, then fatigue, then distraction. Some of this may be ordinary legal process. But the pattern of spectacle layered over scandal should at least give us pause. The documents have existed for years, yet the drama unfolds episodically, feeding a culture that increasingly consumes even the gravest abuses as content. If one speaks symbolically, the danger is not only what occurred behind closed doors. The danger is what happens to a civilization when exposure becomes theater and outrage becomes entertainment. History shows that when moral inversion becomes normalized, dissent can accelerate with frightening speed. This video does not claim final answers. Its purpose is simpler and more urgent, to offer a lens that may help you read the signs of the time with sobriety, vigilance, and moral clarity. Redemption through sin, Jacob's ladder, moral inversion, and the achromanic pattern. Before we speak about redemption through sin, we must understand Jacob's ladder. In the book of Genesis, Jacob dreams of a ladder set upon the earth, its top reaching into heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. The image became central in Jewish mysticism. It symbolized the movement between worlds. Earth and heaven connected. Ascent through spiritual refinement. Descent as part of divine economy. In Lurianic Kabbalah, this latter imagery evolved into a cosmology of ascent and descent. Divine sparks had fallen into material reality. The task of humanity was tikkun, restoration, elevating sparks through obedience, prayer, and sanctification of life. The descent into matter was tragic but necessary. The ascent required purification. Now here is the crucial historical turning point. In the mid-17th century, the Jewish world was in a state of deep messianic expectation. Communities across the Ottoman Empire and Europe were living with the trauma of exile and longing for restoration. Into this atmosphere stepped Sabbatai Zevi. Born in Smyrna in 1626, Zevi was a charismatic mystic shaped by Lurianic Kabbalah. In 1665, with the prophetic backing of Nathan of Gaza, he was proclaimed the Messiah. The movement spread with astonishing speed across the Jewish diaspora. Gershom Scholem documents that entire communities entered a state of messianic mobilization. In Sabbatai Zevi, the mystical Messiah, he writes, "Many prepared themselves for the journey to the Holy Land, selling their houses and making ready for departure." Scholem further notes, "The belief spread that the exile was at an end and that the ingathering of Israel was imminent. However, the movement destabilized after Zevi's forced conversion in 1666. Rabbinic authorities across Europe and the Middle East strongly condemned the Sabbatean movement as heretical. Zevi's adoption of Islam did not end the movement. Among his followers, especially the group later known as the Donma, the conversion was interpreted as an outer disguise, masking an inner continuity of the messianic mission. Scholem notes that for these believers, the apostasy was understood not as a collapse, but as part of the redemptive drama itself. But the wider Jewish world reacted decisively. Scholem describes the aftermath as a profound rupture. He writes that the Sabbatean upheaval produced one of the deepest and most far-reaching crises in the whole of Jewish history. He further explains that the rabbinic establishment saw the movement as a catastrophic heresy that threatened the integrity of Torah and communal life. The rabbis spared no effort to uproot every trace of Sabbateanism. The schism was real. For mainstream Judaism, the idea that violation of Torah could be redemptive was intolerable. The Sabbateans were rejected not merely as mistaken, but as dangerous. The ladder was no longer climbed through obedience. It was descended through rupture. The Frankist radicalization. In the 18th century, Jacob Frank emerged as the most extreme heir to these currents. Frank presented himself as the continuer of the Sabbatean messianic mission. In the eyes of many followers, he embodied the further unfolding of the same redemptive drama that had begun with Zevi. Frank's teachings in the words of the Lord openly challenged the binding nature of religious law. "I have come to free the world from all laws and statutes that have existed until now." The words of the Lord, section 15. "One must ascend to the lowest step, only then can one rise." The words of the Lord, section 67. "Wherever Adam trod, there a city was built. But wherever I step, all will be destroyed, for I have not come to build, but to destroy." The words of the Lord, section 26. Sexual antinomianism in the sources. Here, the historical record becomes especially controversial, but important. Scholem writes that Frankism represented a nihilistic doctrine in which the abolition of the law was also applied to the sphere of sexual morality. He further notes that Frankist circles were widely accused by contemporaries of turning the violation of sexual prohibitions into a religious principle. The Frankists were accused of having transformed the breaking of sexual taboos into a religious duty. Transition to the modern case. Now we must again be absolutely clear. There is no documented evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was Sabbatean, Frankist, or consciously following this theology. What follows is a structural comparison, not a claim of lineage. Jeffrey Epstein. Court documents and investigative reporting show that Epstein cultivated relationships with numerous wealthy, famous, and politically connected individuals across multiple countries. Court documents and victim testimony establish systematic sexual exploitation of minors. Young girls were recruited, groomed, trafficked, abused, and in many cases silenced. This is not peripheral wrongdoing. The abuse of children represents one of the deepest moral prohibitions in human civilization. Childhood is the stage in which the I gradually incarnates, the soul unfolds. Innocence represents potential. To violate that stage is to interrupt lawful becoming. It is categorical. Structurally, the comparison some observers draw concerns inversion. In radical antinomian logic, the breaking of the highest law becomes spiritually central. In the Epstein structure, the breaking of one of society's strongest taboos appears to have created leverage. Shared transgression creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates control. Control creates hierarchy. And when such dynamics occur inside dense networks of power and influence, the web of mutual exposure can expand outward, drawing more and more individuals into zones of risk, silence, and potential compromise. It is in this limited structural sense, not as proof of ideology, that some analysts see an echo of the old antinomian pattern, the danger that inverted acts do not remain isolated but tend, by their very nature, to entangle additional souls within the same field of consequence. Once the highest boundary is crossed, silence binds participants. Cultural inversion. Memes circulate. Jokes proliferate. The name becomes shorthand irony. A system involving the exploitation of minors becomes internet spectacle. This too reflects inversion. At the same time, document releases include redactions. Governments promise justice. Many observers perceive incomplete disclosure. Perception of selective transparency deepens distrust. And when scandal becomes theater, attention shifts from structure to spectacle. Anthroposophical frame. Rudolf Steiner warned that when initiation detaches from moral strengthening of the I, forces of Ahriman gain dominance. Intelligence becomes cold and technical. Systems override conscience. In true initiation, descent into matter is followed by moral ascent. In false initiation, descent is weaponized. If transgression becomes instrument of influence, we witness inversion. And when that transgression targets children, innocence itself becomes currency. That is not merely crime, it is desecration. Anthroposophically, childhood is sacred because the I incarnates gradually through lawful development. To exploit that vulnerability interferes with karmic unfolding. Shared wrongdoing creates karmic entanglement. Karmic entanglement creates dependency. Dependency creates hierarchy. Hierarchy becomes system. Outer law remains for the masses. Inner exemption operates for the elite. The karmic warning. The Sabbatean myth framed descent as cosmic repair. Modern inversion offers no repair. Only leverage. Only silence. Only architecture. Anthroposophy teaches that karma is law. Every deed enters the fabric of destiny. No network escapes it. No elite circle escapes it. No civilization escapes it. But here we must look uncomfortably at ourselves, because karmic entanglement does not occur only through action. It can also occur through conscious complicity. If we trivialize evil through irony, if we reduce systemic abuse to memes, if we consume moral catastrophe as spectacle, if we prefer the theater of outrage to the discipline of clear seeing, then threads of that same karmic fabric begin, subtly but truly, to bind us as well. Not in the same degree, not in the same guilt, but in the same field. Anthroposophy is uncompromising on this point. What we inwardly consent to, what we knowingly normalize, what we allow to become entertainment for the soul, shapes the moral atmosphere we help sustain. And in that sense, passive fascination can become a faint but real form of participation. This is the danger of the age of spectacle. The danger is not only what powerful men do in darkness. The danger is what happens to the collective soul when outrage becomes content, when horror becomes scrollable, when innocence violated becomes just another headline between advertisements. If we allow that hardening to take root, we too weave threads into the karmic tapestry of the time, and we too will reap what we sow. Spiritual gravity is patient, but it is exact.
どうしてみんな普通にしていられるんだ。知らないのか。奴らは食べてたんだ。子供を食べてたんだ。子供を食べてたんだよ。
政治エレイトが未成年を含む人身売買組織を運営していたというこれは嘘です。ではこの陰謀論はどこから始まったのでしょうか。ラブトゥーゲットアピザって他にどういう意味があるっていうんですか。これが陰謀論の証拠だなんて。人間を食べたの。人間の肉よ。奴らは悪魔だ。
全て証明できる。その子供たちと話したんだ。証拠は全部揃っている。それからみんなに言っておくが、私は自殺願望はない。